trial, you will hear about the history of the Goonies from some of its earlier members, Alex Vaughn, Alvin Vaughn, and Raymond Parks. These three are some of the cooperators I talked about earlier, and they will give you an inside look into the gang's rise to power. You'll learn that the Goonies were originated by the Vaughn brothers sometime around 2009 after one of their other brothers was killed. The Goonies were a faction or a branch of the Gangster Disciples. At the time, they called themselves Goonie Boss, and they operated under the structure that each member was a boss of the gang. Make no mistake that the Goonies were a gang and they were engaged in illegal activity at this time, but the primary focus was not violence. That all changed sometime around 2014. When Alvin Vaughn came home from doing some time in jail, the Goonies were younger, they were more violent, and they were led by Romeo Blackman. They called themselves the Goonie Gang. Each member was no longer a boss, and Romeo Blackman was the leader of the Goonies because he was the most feared and he was the most violent member. Members joined the Goonies by being jumped or blessed into the gang. Those who were jumped had to sustain a 60-second beating by fellow gang members. Those who were blessed were close family and friends, and instead of a beating, simply had to establish their loyalty to the gang. Violations occurred when a Goonie member did something wrong, like snitch on another Goonie. This could be anything from a beating by other members of the gang to death, and rewards occurred when they did something right, like kill a rival gang member. This could be anything from not having to commit another shooting for a while, to increase respect within the gang. Loyalty to the Goonies was shown in a variety of ways. For example, its members made matching clothing to express their allegiance to the gang. In this photo, Romeo Blackman is depicted on the far left with other members of the Goonies. Goonie Gang O-Dog is written on his shirt. The Goonies used social media to express their loyalty to the gang. Blackman's Facebook name was Romeo Goonie Blackman. The Goonies posted photos, videos, status updates, and messages expressing their allegiance to the Goonies, taunting rival gangs and bragging about the crimes they committed. Loyalty was further established by Goonie members attending gang meetings and paying dues. The money collected was often used to buy guns for the gang, to arm them for conflict. These pieces of evidence will help establish to you that the Goonies were a criminal enterprise and each of the defendants were part of that enterprise. The Goonies were smart. They knew what they were doing, and they knew how to work together to steal guns, to sell drugs, to maintain power, to intimidate, and ultimately to commit violence, because in the Goonies' world, violence was power, which brings us to the next part of the evidence, Romeo Blackman's rise to power. Romeo Blackman essentially murdered his way to the top of the Goonies by committing back-to-back shootings in the span of 2 months in early 2014. The first murder happened in January of 2014 when Romeo Blackman killed Jonathan Johnson. You'll learn that Blackman murdered Johnson because he believed Johnson and his best friend Alonzo Williams were snitches. A Goonie house had been raided by law enforcement, and Blackman thought it was because Johnson and Williams had talked to law enforcement. Prior to the murder, you'll learn that Blackman and Johnson got into a fight over the raid. Blackman was mad at Johnson, and he couldn't let it go. So after the fight, Blackman got out a gun. Blackman then went to an apartment complex, found Johnson in the lobby, and shot him 5 times. He left him there to die on the steps, because to him, Johnson was a snitch, and individuals who cooperate with law enforcement should be killed, should be silenced. Romeo Blackman's next victim was Alonzo Williams. On March 21st, 2014, nearly 2 months to the day after Blackman murdered Johnson, he killed Williams, who everyone knew as Zoe. Blackman was still mad at Williams for the raid that had occurred for the same reason he had killed Johnson. But now, Blackman had another reason to silence Williams, because he believed Williams had told law enforcement that Blackman killed Johnson. One morning, Blackman saw Williams walking down the street. He waited for Williams until the moment was right, and then Blackman shot him. Bleeding, Zoe tried to stumble up a neighbor's front porch to tell him what had happened before collapsing on those steps. Zoe was dead. Another snitch was silenced. Blackman committed these murders for the Goonies. He did it to silence Johnson and Williams from talking to law enforcement, but he also did it to show others that the Goonies weren't messing around, and word of Blackman's violence spread. After these back-to-back murders, respect for him within the gang exploded, and the Goonies chose him to be their leader. Under Blackman's leadership, the Goonies knew how to work in teams. They knew there was strength in numbers. It allowed the Goonies to plan, to share information, to share money, to share guns. For example, when a Goonie went on a shooting, they often drove multiple cars, a lookout car, a shooter car, and a buffer car, to slow down or block the police. They even recruited females to unknowingly assist. That's exactly what happened during the murder of Stanley Bobo. At trial, you will learn that Defendant Blackman was driving a Chrysler minivan that the Goonies had stole through gang opposition territory looking for someone to kill, and that other Goonies were trailing that minivan to help act as decoys, that Blackman had brought gloves and masks for everyone to wear. Defendant Smith and a man named Quante Hughes were in the back seat with their guns ready to shoot. When the van saw Stanley Bobo, Blackman ordered the kill. Shoot him. That one. So Smith and Hughes slid open that van door and they fired at Bobo. They shot and they killed Stanley Bobo, but in the process, Smith accidentally shot Hughes. A high-speed police chase ensued, and during that chase, Blackman yelled for Hughes, who had been shot, to hold his arm tight to prevent blood from getting on the van. Blackman then crashed that van and everyone got out and ran. Only Hughes was caught. Blackman got away. Smith got away. Goonie teamwork at its finest. It wasn't just teamwork the Goonies were good at. They also understood the importance of protecting their territory. You see, part of why the Goonies were successful is because they were feared and they took action when it was necessary. When something happened in the Goonies' territory, they knew about it. They were the ultimate authority when it came to activities or conflicts on their blocks. To illustrate this, let me tell you about the murder of Romeo Hicks, another victim of the Goonies. And prior to the murder, you'll learn that Hicks and one of Terman's neighbors got into an altercation. As protectors of the block, Terman's neighbor turned to the Goonies for assistance. Terman's neighbor came to Terman's house, and he asked for help. So what did Terman do? He grabbed a Goonie gun, and Terman, his neighborhood dog, and Defendant Blackman went with that neighbor to find Hicks. And when Terman found Romeo Hicks, he shot and killed him in the middle of the street. As simple as that. The Goonies had a reputation to uphold, and they had territory to protect. You heard earlier about some of the roles of the Goonies. There were the drivers, there were drug dealers, there were gun suppliers, and of course there were the individuals who committed shootings. If you were a Goonie, you were expected to put in work. This is especially true if you were a shorty, which is what they called the younger Goonies under 18. Shorties rose the ranks by putting in work. And as we discussed previously, the most respected kind of work were those shootings. The most ambitious shorties wanted to shoot. To illustrate this, let me tell you a little bit about the murder of Gerald Sias and a shooting of Stephen Wilborn. On May 26, 2016, the Goonies murdered Gerald Sias while he was inside of a barbershop full of customers waiting to get his haircut. They shot his best friend Stephen Wilborn, who lived but has endured over 20 surgeries to his leg because of the shooting. A Goonie named Nathaniel McElroy provided the gun, and Defendant Blackman ordered the kill. You see, the Goonies were seeking revenge for the murder of a beloved Goonie family member who everyone called Cushy. The Goonies suspected that Cushy had been killed by a rival gang member named Tez. One day, the Goonies learned that Tez was at a nearby barbershop getting his haircut. So the Goonies, led by Defendant Blackman, made a plan. They would go to the barbershop and they would kill Tez. After McElroy provided the Goonies a gun, another Goonie drove them to the barbershop. Defendant Blackman sat in the back seat of that car with a shorty who they called Tuka. Blackman chose Tuka. He passed Tuka the gun, and he coached him through it. Put your hood up, tie your shoes tight, do this for Cushy. The Goonies parked in an alley behind the barbershop. Tuka got out of the car, went into that barbershop full of people, including a little boy, and he shot at Tez. But he missed. Instead, Tuka murdered Gerald Sias and badly injured Stephen Wilborn, two men just there trying to get a haircut. Unfortunately, this was a common occurrence for the Goonies. When they were out for revenge, when they were targeting the ops, the Goonies instead killed random innocent people. Another example of this is the murder of Kenneth Whitaker. In the early morning hours of July 1st, 2016, the Goonies, including defendants Turman and Blackman, murdered Kenneth Whitaker while he was walking home from work. His body was found on the sidewalk outside of an elementary school. And during trial, you'll learn that just hours before Kenneth Whitaker's murder, the Goonies learned that one of their own, Winnie, had been killed. News of Winnie's death hit the Goonies hard. They believed a rival gang was responsible for the murder, and they wanted revenge. So the Goonies gathered up, Defendant Turman, Defendant Blackman, and others, and they drove around in cars looking for somebody to kill until they found Kenneth Whitaker on the street alone, walking home from work to his family. Remember when I talked to you earlier about recordings? Well, during this part of the trial, you will hear a recording between Defendant Turman and Alex Vaughn, who was cooperating with the government. And during the recording, Defendant Turman tells Alex about the murder. In his own words, Turman explains how all the Goonies were at the crib and how Turman was ready to slide and, quote, "A motherfucker need to leave this earth." He tells Alex, "We drove everywhere, and that a motherfucker caught a motherfucker right there in front of Stagg Elementary School, the location of Kenneth Whitaker's murder." Turman continues, "We acting crazy, bro, and I let them know. Shut things down, early never late, every day, early never late, early never late." Because the Goonies, as Defendant Turman explained, know how to put in work. They know how to murder someone in the early morning before the rest of the world wakes up. If it wasn't clear already, the Goonies shot first and asked questions later. Crystal Jackson, Gerald Sias, Stanley Bobo, Kenneth Whitaker, all people just trying to live their life caught up in the Goonies' violence, simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Another example of this is the murder of Davin Horace. On January 15th, 2016, Defendant Blackman and another Goonie named Rashad Wells murdered Davin Horace on a neighborhood block as Horace exited a car. You'll watch video footage of this murder. It captures Defendant Blackman and Wells walk through the grass of a vacant lot, cut through a covered gangway, and wait. They hide and they wait. Sometime later, the footage shows a car pull up, Horace get out of the car, and Blackman and Wells then ambush Horace firing repeated shots. Horace's body lies in the street as Blackman and Wells run off. Davin Horace, or D-Money as many called him, was not a rival gang member. He was simply present on the block getting out of a car in rival gang territory. Another example of the Goonies shoot first, ask questions later, is the murder of Andre Donner. On December 13th, 2015, Defendant Blackman murdered Andre Donner by shooting him point blank in the face. Blackman was riding in a silver SUV with a man named DeMarco Bennett when they passed Donner on the street believing Donner to be a rival gang member. They pulled up. Blackman called Donner over to the car, and Donner walked closer. Blackman then got out of the car, pointed a gun at Donner, and he shot him in the face and in the body. Donner fell to the ground, and Blackman shot him again. Blackman got back into the SUV, and Bennett drove away. As they were fleeing the murder scene, Bennett ran a stop sign. A police officer followed the car and signaled for that car to stop. When Bennett stopped the car, Defendant Blackman fled and ran into the nearby home of a female friend. Law enforcement searched the area and recovered a firearm in the neighbor's backyard. That firearm matched fired bullets and fired cartridge cases recovered from the murder scene and from the body of Andre Donner. We've talked about a lot of shootings and a lot of murders. Unfortunately, there are more to discuss, but I'd like to pause for a minute and talk to you about how the Goonies were able to commit all of these murders, how they were able to get their guns, because, you see, the Goonies were obsessed with their guns. Guns were the lifeblood of the gang, and there were several ways that the Goonies got guns. Sometimes the Goonies relied on fellow Goonie Nathaniel McElroy to get them guns. You'll learn that McElroy had a connection in Kalamazoo, Michigan, to illegally purchase guns, and then he brought these guns back to Chicago for the Goonies. Sometimes the Goonies relied on a former Chicago public school teacher named Brent Turpin to get them guns. You'll hear from Brent Turpin during this trial, and he'll explain to you how a CPS teacher got wrapped up in the Goonies, providing firearms to the gang. And sometimes the Goonies just stole their guns. You'll learn that on June 22nd, 2016, Defendant Blackman, some other Goonies, and a man named Gerald Bumper broke into a gun store in Streator, Illinois. First, the Goonies stole a Jeep. In a crazy stroke of luck, that Jeep happened to be filled with a box containing a lot of ammunition. Then the Goonies ran that Jeep into a gun store, and they stole approximately 20 firearms. After they burglarized the gun store, Defendant Blackman and other Goonies went back to a house with the stolen guns. Remember when I told you that you would see videos from social media? Well, during this part of the trial, you'll see several videos of Defendant Blackman and other Goonies holding, pointing, and bragging about their stolen guns. You'll see the tags still on the guns in those videos, and you'll see that stolen ammunition box in the videos. You'll learn that after scoring big in Streator, Defendant Blackman and the other Goonies took these guns back to Chicago, back to Englewood. But there was one problem: Gerald Bumper. You see, after the gun store burglary in Streator, some of the Goonies believed Gerald Bumper was going to snitch on them. They believed Bumper was going to tell law enforcement about their involvement in the gun store burglary, so they lured Bumper to Chicago, and a fellow Goonie shot and killed him. They left him in a covered gangway, or, as the Goonies called it, a cut. They disposed of their problem and made sure that Bumper could not snitch on them for the gun store burglary. If you're wondering how the Goonies could turn on someone who they just committed a crime with, you'll learn this wasn't the first time. I started my time with you today by talking about the murder of Crystal Jackson, a murder that occurred outside of the Loomis Food Mart. You'll learn more details about that murder during this trial, that Defendant Smith and Blackman killed Crystal Jackson. You'll learn that 3 other individuals were in the car with Crystal Jackson when she was murdered. They all survived, but 2 were shot. 2 of those survivors will testify during this trial, and they'll explain to you how a shooter ambushed their car. That Crystal was in the front passenger seat, and that she tried to duck and jump into the back of the car to avoid the bullets. You'll watch a video of the murder, and you'll learn that Defendant Smith was the one who killed Crystal Jackson, that the Goonies were after members of a rival gang. That Smith, Blackman, and a female drove and parked near the Loomis Food Mart that evening. That Smith got out of the car while Blackman and that female waited. And that while sitting there, the female heard pops, but Blackman told her not to worry. It was just fireworks. That Smith then came back running to the car, and they left the area. After the shooting, Defendant Smith and Blackman told other Goonies what had happened. They bragged about having shot 2 of their rival gang members. Back at the Goonies' house, Smith poured bleach on his hands, a tactic Goonie members used to get rid of gunshot residue, except they didn't kill a rival gang member. They killed a woman who was simply sitting in the car. The story of Crystal Jackson's murder does not end there. You'll learn that the gun used to kill Crystal Jackson was a Goonie gun, meaning it was a gun that the gang shared to commit crimes. A few days after Crystal Jackson's murder, a Goonie named Quincent Hayes was walking with Defendant Blackman when they saw some police officers. Blackman was carrying the gun that was used to kill Crystal Jackson, so he gave it to Hayes, and he told him run. Hayes took the gun and he ran, but eventually he was caught and he was arrested for possessing a firearm. This worried Defendant Smith, who had used that firearm to kill Crystal Jackson. Hayes was released from jail shortly after this police encounter, and Smith was convinced that Hayes had snitched on him to law enforcement. So he decided to do what Goonies do, kill Hayes. Quincent Hayes will testify during this trial. You'll learn that after this incident, many of the Goonies thought he was dead, even to this very day. Hayes, or as many called him, Man, will tell you about how Defendant Smith tried to call him on February 4th, 2015, tried to silence Man because Smith thought he was a snitch. That morning, Smith offered to walk Hayes to school. While on their way, Hayes asked Smith to hold his cigarette while Hayes jumped a fence. When Hayes turned around to get it back, Smith had a gun pointed in his face. Smith shot Hayes 9 times that day. Smith bragged to members of the Goonies that he had killed Man. Hayes' family told the Goonies that Hayes was dead, but he is not dead and he will be here to testify. The Goonies terrorized the south side of Chicago while they were in power. Their violence destroyed families, and it destroyed communities, schools, barbershops, food marts. Nowhere was safe. Over the next several weeks, my partners and I will present to you all of the evidence I have just previewed, and more, all of the crimes and acts of violence committed by the Goonies. Keep in mind that not every single crime was committed by all 3 of the defendants seated before you, but every crime was part of the Goonie conspiracy. The conspiracy that defendants Blackman, Smith, and Turman participated in, and as part of the conspiracy, they are responsible for those acts of violence. The evidence we will present throughout this trial will prove all of these defendants guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It will prove to you that defendants Romeo Blackman, Terrence Smith, and Jolicious Turman conspired with each other and with other members of the Goonies to commit racketeering acts, including murder and attempted murder. The evidence will also prove that defendants Blackman, Smith, and Turman murdered and/or attempted to murder multiple victims. As I told you earlier, at the end of this trial, my partners will get back up here and have a chance to talk with you again. And when they do, they will ask you to return the only verdict consistent with the evidence in this case, that defendants Romeo Blackman, Terrence Smith, and Jolicious Turman are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Thank you.